Hey everybody, welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. As many of you know, today we are going to learn the straight granny shell stitch. So this is that simple little shell stitch worked back and forth instead of around and around in a granny square. For those of you watching our live stream crochet party, you'll probably recognize this blanket I'm building. I'm using the granny shell stitch to make a twin-sized-ish blanket through my stash, and I'm going to do it all in rainbow colors. So I've started with red and I'm going to work my way right through the rainbow. Some of you expressed a desire to make this kind of a blanket along with me, so after today's tutorial you'll know everything you need to know about the straight granny shell stitch to make a blanket of your own. For anybody who wants to make exactly the same kind of blanket, I started with 133 chains in my foundation chain row. I'm using a size 6mm or a J hook, and I'm using chunky weight or heavy worsted weight yarn, so sizes 4 and 5 yarn, and this is all in acrylic. Today's tutorial, however, is just on the stitch, so we're going to work up a sample-sized version of the granny shell stitch, and because I like to work my samplers into something useful, we're going to make a dishcloth. After this tutorial, you'll know the formula for figuring out how big you might want to make your granny square project or granny straight shell stitch project. But today we're going to make this handy dandy little dishcloth, and I'm using cotton yarn for it. To make sure you don't miss an episode of our live stream crochet party and you can sit down and crochet along with me and Mr. InStitches, make sure you're subscribed, you've got your little bell notification button clicked, and keep an eye on your subscription feed. That's where new videos are posted, information concerning live feeds are posted, and anything we post on the community board all shows up in your subscription feed. And as little Lula said at the beginning of the tutorial, thank you so much for 200,000 subs! Woo! And as a special thank you gift to all of you for your love and support and friendship, today's written pattern is available for free over on our website. You can find the link to our pattern workshop page in the description box down below. Pop over, pick up a free copy of that pattern. It's a really good one to have in your project journal. And if you're still learning how to read patterns, this is a great one to follow along with as we do today's tutorial. So let's grab our hooks, grab our yarn, grab that free copy of the pattern. We'll head on over to the craft table and we will stitch up the straight granny shell stitch into a dishcloth together. In order to make our straight granny shell stitch dishcloths, you need about 45 to 50 grams of medium weight size 4 cotton yarn. This is a lot more than that. This is just a scrap I'm using up. You're going to need a pair of scissors, a yarn needle, and today I'm using a 5mm hook, or an H or 8 in the US, also known as a size 6 in the UK. And once you've got all that together, we can get started. The granny shell stitch in a straight pattern can be worked over any multiple of 3 chains plus 4 for turning at the end. So your foundation chain row needs to be any number that is a multiple of 3 plus 4 turning chains. For this sample size dishcloth, we're going to start with a slip knot, and we're going to chain 28. Count them up, make sure you have 28 chains, and 28 is a foundation chain row that is a multiple of 3, so 3 times 8 is 24, plus 4 extra chains brings us up to 28. So that's how I arrived at the number 28. To begin row 1, we're going to find the 7th chain from the hook, so count back 7, and into that 7th chain you're going to work 3 double crochet. So 3 double crochet into that 7th chain away from the hook. And if you're familiar with the granny square, you'll know that 3 double crochet worked into the same stitch, chain, or space counts as our little granny shell. So there's our shell, 3 double crochet. The Those 7 turning chains, so those extra chains that turn on the end, counts as a double crochet chain 1 in this case. So the first or every odd row of this pattern is going to begin and end with a double crochet or a chain 4. So that's what that represents. Now for a little bit of extra breathing room for all our successive shells, I like to chain 1 in between the shells. It doesn't really count. You wouldn't count this stitch for the pattern. It's just kind of like giving a little bit of extra space between our shells. You're going to look at your foundation chain row. You're going to skip 2 chains, find the next one, and work that granny shell into it. 3 double crochet. Chain 1 for a little spacer, and repeat. Skip 2 chains, find the third, and work 3 double crochet or that granny shell into it. After you work 3 double crochet, make sure you chain 1, and you can continue this little pattern of skipping 2 chains, finding the third, and working 3 double crochet into it all the way across until you get to your last 3 chains. Once you've worked that little shell pattern all the way across, each of your shells separated by a little chain, we're not going to really bother worrying about counting the chains, but you can stretch out that foundation chain row and your first row should look something like this. When you get to the end and you have 3 chains left, skip 2 chains and double crochet once into the last chain. So row 1 and every odd row begins and ends with a double crochet or a chain 4. That's what this represents over here. Count them up. You should have 7 shells in your first row. So every odd row of this little pattern should have 7 shells in it. And this is how we start row 2. Chain 3. So every row 2 or even row begins with a chain 3. We turn our work. And into that first chain 1 space we created, we're going to work 2 double crochet. So that chain 3 plus the 2 double crochet we're working into this little chain 1 space is going to count as our first shell. So every even row begins with a full shell. Chain 3 counts as a double crochet. You work 2 more actual double crochets into that chain 1 space, and there's your shell. Chain 1 for a little spacer, a little bit of breathing room in between our shells. And here we go. You just hop over to the next chain 1 space and work a shell into it. 3 double crochet. The 3 double crochet or the shell worked in between the shells of the previous row should look something like that. Don't forget to chain 1 more on your way out, and that's what you're going to do all the way across. So into every single chain 1 space in an even row or a row 2 like we're on right now, you work 3 double crochet, chain 1, or a granny shell, chain 1, into every single one of those chain 1 spaces from the previous row. And the little chain 1 spaces are what separate our shells. So you're just working in between the shells. Nice and simple, 3 double crochets in that little chain 1 spacer into every single space all the way across. When you get all the way across an even row, or in this case, row 2, the last thing you come up against is a space. So remember that big 7 chains on the beginning of our very first row counts as a chain 4, which is a double crochet chain 1 in this case. So it's basically a space. You're going to work a full shell into it, which is 3 double crochet, because an even row begins and ends with a full shell. So that first row always looks a little wonky, but don't worry about it. And there you go. Even row begins with a shell, which is a chain 3, and then 2 double crochets into that first space. Work that shell stitch all the way across in between all the shells from the previous row, and when you get to the end, you'll be confronted with a shell and typically a chain 1 and a double crochet or a chain 3 from the previous row. And into that big space, you just work a full shell. We're back now to an odd row, so we're going to chain 4 to begin an odd row. That counts as a double crochet, chain 1. Spin your work around and you look for the first chain 1 space. We're going to work a full shell into that first space between the shells from the previous row, because every odd row begins and ends with a double crochet. So in this case, the double crochet is chain 3 plus an extra chain for your little sort of spacer, so a chain 4. Every odd row begins with chain 4. That's what it's going to look like. So you're going to have this little sort of, I don't know, that kind of almost looks like an 8. Big space. Shell in between shells, chain 1, work for the next shell, 3 double crochets into it, and off you go, all the way across. Please visit our shop and purchase a pattern. It helps support our show, and we'll put a link to our shop in the description box down below. When you get all the way across to the end of an odd row, you are confronted with your last shell, worked in between the 2 shells from the previous row, and row 2s, or even rows, always begin and end with a full shell. In this case, that chain 3 and those 2 double crochet are the shell. So you look for the top of the chain 3, make sure you chain 1 as you leave your last shell, and double crochet right into the top of that chain 3. And this way, your odd row will begin and end with a double crochet or a post. So you can sort of look at it like a post, chain 1, and on this side a post and a chain 1. And that's your little chain 4s that start. Okay, row 2, even rows. We chain 3 to begin. That chain 3 counts as a double crochet, and we're going to finish the full shell working 2 more double crochet into that space. So even rows begin and end with a shell. Odd rows begin and end with a post. Remember, there are single chains in between all of our little motifs, and then you just work shells into the spaces between the shells from the previous row. And that is all you need to know for this little stitch pattern. Go ahead and work a few more rows. You want to try and square up your dishcloth. I like squarish dishcloths, but you can continue to work this pattern until your dishcloth is as tall as you like, and then we're going to square it off and give it a little border. I have now completed 12 rows of the little granny straight stitch. So a couple things to note. In our first row we have 7 shells. That's an odd row. In an even row you'll have 8 shells. So you'll have 1 more shell in your even rows than you do in your odd rows. It's very easy to count. You just sort of count by bouncing on a diagonal back and forth between the shells. I have 12 rows, and that looks pretty square to me. This is, after all, just a little stitch sampler and a handy little washcloth. So in order to finish it off, you could just clip your yarn and fasten off here if you were working on a blanket. But because we're going to make this into a nice tidy little dishcloth, we're just going to work a simple single crochet stitch all the way around. And I'm going to begin by working straight down this sort of first raw side we have. And I'm going to work 2 single crochet into the edge of each row. So sometimes that will be a double crochet, and sometimes that will be a chain 3. So 2 single crochet into the edge of each row. I'm going to chain 1 to begin, and I'm going to start right into the first double crochet. So I'm going to work along the raw side of it. I'm just going to pick up a loop, a piece of the edge of the stitch, and work a single crochet. Nothing fancy here. There's the bottom half of that double crochet. I'm just going to pick up a piece of the loop along the edge and work my next single crochet. So if I have 12 rows in this sort of square in total, I should have a total of 24 single crochet worked down the edge of the raw side. And I'm going to try and mirror that on the other side, so I should have exactly the same stitch count on both sides. Like I said, there's no real fine science to this. You just want to grab a piece of the edge. Not always that easy to find. There it is. I'm working on the side of a chain 3 now. And there's the next one. So 2 little single crochet into that, and then single crochet twice into the edge of the next double crochet, and so on. I'm going to try and work an even 24 single crochet down the first raw side of my little dishcloth here, and I'll see you at the bottom corner. There we go. That's 24 even single crochets worked down that first raw edge. I'm at the bottom, And into that same stitch, or that same sort of edge of a chain that I worked my last single crochet into, I'm just going to chain 1 and single crochet back into the same place. This is just going to give me a little tidy corner. Nothing fancy, it's just sort of going to make a little tiny edge for me. And now we're working across the bottom. This is pretty easy. All you want to do is just work a single crochet into the bottom of each chain all the way across. And just take your time. Sometimes it's going to look a little funny. If you can't quite get the stitch, just roll that chain foundation until you can. And then there's always going to be one underneath the shell you worked. And it'll look something like that. Once you get all the way across, the last single crochet you're going to work will be in that first chain you made, and your little tail might still be visible there. And then your bottom will look something like that. Nice and smooth. There's sort of a single crochet worked into the bottom of every single chain all the way across. We're going to do the same little thing in this corner. Chain 1 and single crochet into the same place that we worked our last single crochet. And then you're going to mirror what you did on the other side. So you're going to work an even 24 single crochet up your other raw edge so that you get a nice square look going. Remember to work 2 single crochet into the edge of each row. Just grab the little edges of the stitches or the chains. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be even so that it looks like the other side. So that's 24 single crochet in total all the way up the other raw side. And now we're going to do the easy part and work across the top of our last row of granny shell stitch. So same thing in the corner. I'm going to chain 1 and single crochet into the same little place that I worked that last single crochet of the side. And now I'm going to single crochet in each stitch all the way across. And I'm going to skip the chains. So I'm going to skip the chain 1s in between my shells. And there's a reason for that. We want the bottom and the top to sort of match. Remember way back in the beginning I said we're going to sort of ignore the chain 1s as an actual stitch. We're just going to sort of concentrate on the shells. By closing in and just sort of skipping over those little chain 1 spaces, or the chains, and pretending that they're really not there, we're going to make the top match the bottom. So there'll be a sort of a little bit of give in the center, but the whole border will be nice and stiff and even. So we should have roughly 24 single crochet along each side. So just work a single crochet in the top of each of those double crochets, skip over the little chain 1s, just ignore them like they're not there, and single crochet across the last side of our little dishcloth. Alright, that's about 24 single crochet all the way across the top of my last row, and I skipped the chains, so I didn't work a single crochet in the chain or even in the space. I only worked them in the top of the double crochet, which gives it a little more strength and firmness and also makes it match the bottom of our little dishcloth. And right back here at the beginning, I'm just going to chain 1 for my little corner and slip stitch to join into the first single crochet I made, working down that edge. And because this is a little dishcloth, I'm going to work a little hanger into it. So I'm just going to quickly chain 12. And without twisting my chain, I'm going to bring my hook back down to the same stitch that I just left a moment ago. Slip stitch to join, and there's my little hanger. I'm going to snip my yarn, fasten off, and I'm going to weave in my tail. And if you still have your tail down below on the other end, make sure you weave that in too. Just grab your yarn needle, flip your little dishcloth over, and you can just pick up the backs of the stitches of either the single crochet row going down the side or across the top of your little dishcloth, and just weave your little bit of tail in back and forth across the backs of those stitches, and that will ensure that it doesn't go anywhere. And once you've woven in your tails, you're done! ready for use in the sink. And that is the straight granny shell stitch. And now you know how to work it into any sized project. If you want to keep an eye on the progression of this particular blanket or build one along with me, make sure you tune into our live stream crochet party. We'll be having another one next week. It's a nice opportunity to sit down, put your feet up, set a little time aside for some crochet during the week in an otherwise busy schedule, and spend some time with some like-minded, crafty people. You, of course, can bring whatever project you want, but I'll be working on this. So we'll see you soon on the Jayda InStitches show. Until then, stay safe, stay crafty, and have an awesome week, everybody. Bye!